Welcome to a special edition of the Napoleon's Triumph channel with Patrick, your host. So David has asked me to do a little video about my latest gaming experience. It's a solitaire gaming experience. And given that we're in lockdown in Auckland, we haven't been able to get together. So I'm going to shoot this and send it up to him, and hopefully you guys are watching this. So, what have I been playing? I've been playing, let's see if I can find the box here. Yep, here we go. The Doodle Rate, Enemy Coast Ahead. It's the second in the Enemy Coast Ahead series. The first being the Dam Busters, about the classic Dam Busters raid. This one is about the Doodle Rate, which in 1942, which is a raid carried out by the US against Japan as a kind of a retaliatory action after Pearl Harbor, and it involved specially modified B-25s loaded onto a carrier deck and flying to Japan, where historically they didn't really do that much damage, and then attempting to land in China. Obviously they had severe fuel concerns because it was really right on the margins of what the B-25, the range of the B-25, and a lot of them ditched, and others crash landed, and others had to trek through China, and the accompanying scenario book has a lot of the historical background information about this. So what is it? It's a game that can be divided essentially into 4 or 5 parts, each its own sort of mini game. And there is a lot of the game happens to you, but however there are enough important strategic decisions to make you feel involved in planning the whole operation. So the first part is the planning segment. So what I can say about this game is that it really it feels like a story being told, and you feel like you're in command of an operation and all the different dimensions of that operation. So the first part is the planning segment. So what happened here was I managed to get my diplomat in the USSR, Thompson, to get the Russians to agree for us to land in Vladivostok, which is different to what happened historically. That's actually quite hard to achieve, but I figured that it was worth a try, because if you do it, Vladivostok is much closer than China, so you can afford to not worry so much about fuel and maybe load up your B-25s with more ordnance. I managed to get Nimitz to agree to a rendezvous with another carrier force. And then you go into the modifications. So those are the modifications I chose for my plane. Importantly, I chose extra ordnance, which turned out to be really useful. You go on to security, where you decide whether or not the B-25 crews are going to train at McClellan Field in Sacramento or Eglin Field. So I think Eglin is further away, so you get more security, but you get less opportunity to train. And you can choose a variety of different security measures, and they have different effects on morale and security. And then you can train your crews. And finally, you transit onto the carrier. So I chose to go for a lot of security. So it meant that I ended up not having too much morale, but I invested heavily in bombing training and some navigation skill and a little bit of gunnery. So then you go on to the naval segment, which is all about approaching Japan before launching your B-25s. So just out of San Francisco, Japanese intelligence managed to pick up that something was going on. I had 2 submarines ready to make contact. The first over here, where my rendezvous point for the Task Force 16 carrier fleet was set up, and I managed to successfully rendezvous, even though we didn't make contact with the submarine. And so the two task forces joined up, and I decided to go for a launch point right near Japan, which is probably the riskiest strategy. So you can choose to launch further back, but then you have more potential fuel issues. If you decide to launch closer, you're risking the Japanese detecting the fleet and launching an airstrike on it, and you're putting a lot of your naval assets at risk. However, launching closer means that your B-25s are much better placed in terms of fuel. But you're also risking an emergency launch, which is not as good as a planned launch. Anyway, I did actually manage to get all the way into the last sea zone, but at that stage it became very obvious that the Japanese had detected my fleet, and I decided that I couldn't afford not to do an emergency launch. So I had to launch my B-25s, which resulted in a couple of them crashing off the carrier deck. And then you move on to the flight map. The flight map, we ended up quite close to Japan, and some Japanese boats detected us as we were flying over. The Japanese alert level increased quite rapidly, which meant that by the time that my B-25s were going over Japan, their defenses were more or less ready. Luckily, even though it was an emergency launch, we were able to launch at daytime, and most of my bombers arrived over Japan during the day. Having no night flying training, it would have made it very difficult for them to find their targets. Once you successfully enter one of the city targets, you move on to the attack phase. And here we had a lot of success, thanks in part to the investment I had in bombing and the extra ordnance that my B-25s were carrying. Tokyo in particular was heavily hit, and we scored hit on the Ryuho carrier, which was being refitted in the Tokyo shipping bay. As well as that, Osaka was hit, and Nagoya was pretty heavily hit as well. On the way out, I lost a lot of B-25s to the Japanese retaliating with interceptors on the way out, and very unluckily, the weather turned really bad as we neared Vladivostok. On top of that, finding Vladivostok at night, because it was nighttime by the time they got there, was extremely difficult, and a lot of my B-25s ditched or their landings failed. Some crews were injured, and only 3 B-25s managed to land unscathed at Vladivostok, one of which was Doodle himself. And those were my losses. So as part of this game, once you complete the campaign, you get to find out what happened to your what happens in the next part of the story. So you have different assessments. You have the Army's assessment. So for me, the Army came up as HAP is happy, which is essentially an assessment of how much damage you did to the Japanese. Oh, I forgot to say, after the airstrike, the Japanese did end up sending an airstrike against my fleet, and overall we lost 2 fuelers and 2 destroyers, which ends up being a catastrophe in naval terms. In terms of the Joint Chiefs, we got, I believe, a mission accomplished. The White House, we got, I think, elated from memory. And you got the effect of the health of the alliances on China and the USSR, and the effect on Japan. So all in all, a really interesting experience. Live historical storytelling, maybe a way of putting it. One of my better solitaire experiences. I would highly recommend this. So that is all I have to say about that. Catch you guys later.